When the president of the HOA attempted to evict him, she had no idea she was stepping into her own nightmare. Malik Patterson had always envisioned owning property in a tranquil, upscale neighborhood. After years of dedication and hard work, he finally made it a reality. The house, a breathtaking 2-story brick residence in Brentwood Estates, Tennessee, was situated on a meticulously manicured lot featuring a wraparound porch and a spacious backyard. It was precisely what he had imagined: peaceful, elegant, and the ideal place to settle down. However, something felt amiss from the very first day. Moving boxes were still scattered along the driveway when Malik noticed eyes peering from behind curtains, watching from porches, lingering just a moment too long as neighbors walked their dogs. No one approached him. There were no friendly introductions, no warm welcomes to the neighborhood, just a heavy silence. Initially, he dismissed it, thinking perhaps the residents were simply reserved and would warm up over time. The first indication that wouldn't happen appeared the following morning. Malik had barely finished brewing his coffee when a sharp knock echoed at the door. He opened it to find a woman in her mid-60s standing on his porch. She wore a neatly pressed beige blouse, pearl earrings, and a pin with the HOA emblem affixed to her cardigan. Her posture was stiff, her expression neutral, but there was something in her eyes that Malik couldn't quite identify. "Good morning," she said, her tone clipped. "I'm Barbara Whitman, president of the Brentwood Estates Homeowners Association." Malik extended a hand, offering a polite smile. "Nice to meet you." "I know who you are," she interrupted, glancing past him into the house. "I wanted to go over a few matters." She handed him a thick stack of printed documents, stapled in the corner: HOA guidelines. Malik skimmed the pages, noting the usual regulations: lawn maintenance, exterior paint restrictions, approved mailbox designs, standard stuff. But then Barbara cleared her throat. "We like to maintain a certain standard here," she said, her gaze settling on the moving truck still parked in the driveway. "I assume you'll have that removed by this evening?" Malik raised an eyebrow. "It'll be gone once I finish unpacking." Barbara nodded, but it wasn't a satisfied nod. It was more like she was making a mental note. "Good," she said. "And just so you're aware, the HOA requires that trash bins be placed at the curb no earlier than 6 a.m. on collection day. I noticed yours were out last night." "I didn't put them out," Malik replied evenly. "The previous owners must have." Barbara pursed her lips. "I see. Well, in the future, please be mindful. We have rules for a reason." And just like that, she turned and walked away. Malik shut the door, exhaling slowly. Maybe she was just particular. A lot of HOA presidents were. He wasn't going to let one uptight neighbor spoil his fresh start. However, the next few days made it abundantly clear that Barbara wasn't merely particular. She was watching him. A warning notice appeared in his mailbox regarding an unauthorized vehicle in the driveway, his own car. A second notice followed about improper lawn maintenance. His grass had grown an inch, maybe 2. Then an HOA violation letter arrived about a porch light that was too bright, despite being the same fixture the previous owner had used. By the end of the week, Malik had amassed a tidy stack of papers from Barbara. He hadn't spoken to her since their initial meeting, but it didn't matter. She had made her presence known. Still, he maintained his composure. Perhaps she treated everyone this way. Maybe he just needed to adhere to rules, and she would back off. But that hope faded quickly when Malik took an evening stroll and passed a group of neighbors chatting in a nearby driveway. They fell silent upon seeing him. One woman offered a tight smile, but nobody else acknowledged his presence. And there, standing in the middle, was Barbara, arms crossed, whispering something to the others. Malik didn't need to hear the words to understand this wasn't about HOA regulations. It was about him. If Barbara believed she could intimidate him into leaving, she was in for a surprise. The letters kept coming. Each morning, Malik discovered a new notice folded neatly in his mailbox, sealed with the Brentwood Estates HOA stamp. Initially, he tossed them into a kitchen drawer, skimming them just enough to confirm what he already knew. Barbara Whitman was determined to make his life miserable. But by the time he received the 5th letter in just 2 weeks, Malik had reached his limit. This time, It concerned his trash cans. Bins must be retrieved within 1 hour of collection to preserve neighborhood aesthetics, the letter stated. Malik stared at the paper, irritation bubbling beneath his skin. He had picked up his bins just as his neighbors had after work. But apparently that wasn't sufficient. Curious, he decided to conduct a little experiment. The next morning, he woke up early and took a leisurely stroll through the neighborhood, paying close attention to the houses. By 9 a.m., dozens of trash bins were still lined up along the curbs. Some weren't even fully closed, lids propped open with overflowing bags. Not a single violation notice was issued to any of them, just his. Malik snapped a few pictures and sent an email to the HOA board, politely inquiring why his bins were an issue while everyone else's were overlooked. There was no response. But 2 days later, Barbara was back on his doorstep. This time, she didn't knock. She simply stood there waiting, arms crossed, clipboard in hand. Malik opened the door and leaned against the frame. "Something I can assist you with?" Barbara didn't answer immediately. She looked over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the interior of his home as if she were taking inventory. Then she held up a form. "This is a formal request of you to submit proof of home ownership," she stated. "We've had complaints." Malik's stomach tightened. "Complaints. Neighbors have expressed concerns," Barbara continued, her voice syrupy yet sharp. "They've noticed unusual activity. Different cars coming and going, furniture deliveries at odd hours. Some are worried you may be renting this property in violation of HOA regulations." Malik let out a short, humorless laugh. "You're kidding." Barbara's face didn't flinch. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "First off, I own this house. Second, I've lived here less than a month. I'm still moving in. That's why there have been deliveries. As for the cars, those are friends and family visiting." Barbara pressed her lips together, her fingers tightening around her clipboard. "Well, we have policies to ensure all homeowners are properly vetted. We'll need to verify your deed." Malik knew exactly what this was. He hadn't asked any other neighbors for proof of home ownership. Just him. Still, he kept his voice steady. "You can pull the records yourself. It's public information." Barbara's eyes narrowed slightly, but she quickly regained her composure, smoothing out her expression. "I prefer if you submitted it directly." Malik tilted his head. "And if I don't?" Barbara's lips curled into something that was meant to be a smile, but there was no warmth behind it. "Then I'll have no choice but to escalate the matter with the HOA board." Malik exhaled slowly, holding back the words that were sitting on the tip of his tongue. She wanted him to react. She wanted him to get angry, to raise his voice, to give her an excuse to label him a problem. So he just smiled. "I'll think about it," he said, then closed the door before she could say another word. Barbara didn't like that. That evening, as Malik sat on his porch sipping a beer, he saw her again, standing at the end of his driveway, talking to a man in a polo shirt and khakis. She gestured toward Malik's house, speaking in hushed tones. The man nodded, scribbling something down on a notepad. Malik didn't have to guess what was happening. Barbara wasn't merely trying to intimidate him anymore. She was searching for a way to get rid of him. But if she thought she could push him out, she was about to learn a hard lesson. The following morning, Malik woke up to an email from the HOA with the subject line, "Notice of violation." It was regarding his porch furniture. According to the email, his outdoor seating arrangement, 2 wicker chairs and a small glass table, did not conform to the aesthetic standards outlined in the HOA guidelines. It was a vague rule, one that clearly wasn't being enforced on anyone else. Malik leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He had walked this neighborhood enough times to know that at least a dozen homes had similar setups. Some even had old plastic chairs that appeared to have been sitting out since the early 2000s. Yet, somehow, his was a problem. He ignored the notice. A day later, another email arrived with the subject line, "Second notice, lawn maintenance violation." Malik frowned. His lawn was freshly cut, edged, and watered. He had spent the entire afternoon trimming the hedges, ensuring everything was spotless. But there it was, a formal complaint stating that his grass was slightly overgrown, warning that fines would be issued if the problem wasn't corrected. Malik knew exactly what was happening. Barbara was attempting to drown him in complaints, stacking minor infractions until she had enough leverage to escalate matters. So he decided to play her game. That evening, he took a leisurely walk to the neighborhood, jotting down every single actual violation he observed. Overgrown yards, broken shutters, faded house numbers, and trash bins still sitting by the curb from the morning before. Then he submitted his own complaints, each one backed with time-stamped photos. It took less than 24 hours for Barbara to show up again. This time, she wasn't alone. She stood at the edge of Malik's driveway with another HOA board member, an older man with salt and pepper hair and a clipboard in hand. Malik recognized him from the HOA website. Stephen Reynolds, vice president. Barbara's expression was tenser than usual, the forced politeness barely masking her irritation. "Mr. Patterson," she greeted, her voice stretched thin. "We received your list of complaints." Malik crossed his arms, nodding. "Good. Then you know I'm not the only one being held to a ridiculous standard." Stephen cleared his throat, glancing at Barbara before speaking. "We appreciate your concerns, but the HOA board determines which issues require action. Not every minor infraction warrants a formal notice." Malik scoffed. "So mine do, but everyone else's don't?" Barbara didn't respond. Instead, she pulled out a printed form and handed it to him. "This is your final warning before fines are issued. Your porch furniture needs to be replaced, and your lawn must remain at the regulated length at all times." Malik stared at the paper, then slowly looked up at Barbara. He wasn't foolish. This wasn't about grass or furniture. This was about making him feel unwelcome. He took a deep breath, forcing a slow smile. "You know, Barbara, I've read the HOA bylaws from top to bottom. Nowhere does it state that a homeowner must replace furniture that's in perfect condition." Barbara stiffened. "It's a matter of neighborhood uniformity." Malik raised an eyebrow. "So you enforce rules that don't exist?" Barbara's jaw twitched. Stephen shifted uncomfortably. For the first time, Malik saw doubt creeping into the board member's expression. He wasn't fully convinced. Malik decided to push a little further. "Let me ask you something," he said, keeping his tone even. "If I were someone else, say one of my neighbors, would we even be having this discussion?" Barbara's nostrils flared. Stephen opened his mouth, hesitated, then closed it again. No answer. Malik nodded, folding the paper in half. "That's what I thought." Barbara inhaled sharply, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "If you refuse to comply, the HOA has the authority to take further action." Malik met her gaze unwaveringly. "Then do what you have to do." Barbara turned on her heel and walked away, her posture stiff with barely contained frustration. Stephen lingered for a second, then followed. Malik watched them leave, gripping the violation notice in his hand. He had just called her bluff. But Barbara wasn't the type to back down easily. Malik expected retaliation. He just didn't anticipate how far she would take it. The next morning, a thick envelope sat in his mailbox. There was no HOA logo this time. Instead, it was from a law firm. Inside was an official complaint filed with the Davidson County Housing Authority, accusing him of being a fraudulent occupant. Barbara had escalated from petty fines to attempting to have him legally removed from his own home. Malik stared at the document, his pulse steady but his hands tightening around the paper. She was genuinely doing this. He read through the complaint. The claims were flimsy. Allegations that he had failed to provide proof of home ownership, suspicions that he was renting the property under false pretenses, and a statement that multiple neighbors had expressed concerns about his presence. No names, no actual proof, just assumptions dressed up in legal jargon. For a moment, Malik considered ignoring it. The accusations wouldn't hold up, but then he realized this wasn't about getting him evicted. It was about wearing him down. Barbara wanted him buried in legal headaches. She wanted him frustrated, drained, willing to just walk away rather than fight back. But what she didn't understand was that she was playing right into his hands. That evening, Malik made a phone call. "Hey, Joe," he said when the line picked up. "I need a favor." Joe Martinez had been Malik's real estate attorney for years. Sharp, relentless, and twice as ruthless as Barbara ever hoped to be. By the next morning, Malik had everything he needed, and he wasn't just going to defend himself. Barbara cleared her throat, lifting a printed document. We are here to address the ongoing issue regarding Mr. Patterson's residence. Given the numerous violations and concerns raised by our community members, I'd like to speak, Malik interrupted, his voice calm but firm. Barbara's lips thinned. You'll have a chance to respond after. No, Malik said, setting down a stack of his own papers. I'm speaking now. A murmur spread through the room. Barbara stiffened, but she gestured for him to continue. This, he said, letting the words hang in the air, is the deed for 216 Oakwood Drive, Barbara's house. The silence that followed was deafening. Malik didn't sit back down. He let the weight of the moment settle, allowing Barbara to process what had just happened. The same woman who had spent weeks trying to have him removed had just discovered that her own house belonged to him, and she hadn't even known. Barbara's mouth opened slightly, but no sound emerged. Then in a quiet, tight voice, she asked, How? The power she had wielded over Malik for weeks had just disintegrated in front of everyone. Malik took his time, letting the weight of his words settle. He wasn't finished. He picked up another document from his neatly stacked pile. Now, let's discuss fraudulent eviction attempts. Barbara's head snapped up. Excuse me. Malik tapped the legal complaint she had filed. You reported me as an illegal occupant. You claimed I had no right to live in my home. He paused, then looked directly at her. Would you care to explain? The room shifted. It wasn't just between Malik and Barbara anymore. People were starting to see it. Barbara opened her mouth. But Malik continued before she could recover. You accused me of violating HOA policies. Yet you repeatedly ignored other violations in this community. He pulled out a stack of printed emails. I filed formal complaints about broken shutters, overgrown lawns, and trash bins left out for days. None of them resulted in violation notices. He turned to the rest of the board. Tell me how this has been happening right in front of you. Barbara let out a shaky breath. Mr. Patterson, I was simply trying to intimidate me into leaving? Malik finished for her. Yeah, I got that. Silence fell. Then a voice from the back of the room broke through. This is a disgrace, an older man muttered. Malik turned to see Mr. Holloway, one of the longest-standing residents of the neighborhood. He shook his head, looking at Barbara. You really tried to evict the man who owns your house? A few scattered documents were exchanged. Barbara, is this true? Barbara's lips parted, but no words came out. She had buried herself. Malik leaned back in his chair. I suggest you start paying up. Wouldn't want to violate any of your own rules, would you? A low chuckle swept through the crowd. Even some of the board members were barely containing their reactions. Barbara's face burned red. She had spent weeks trying to control Malik, and now, in front of the entire HOA, her authority had been reduced to nothing. She clenched her jaw, and the tension left behind was thick. No one moved, no one spoke. The board members shifted uncomfortably, as if finally realizing they had hitched themselves to the wrong wagon. Malik didn't move either. He just sat back, watching. Slowly, the murmurs began. Can you believe this? Someone whispered. She tried to evict the wrong guy. Another chuckled. Stephen Reynolds, still seated at the table, cleared his throat. Well, he started awkwardly, adjusting his tie. I think it's safe to say the situation was mishandled. Mishandled? Malik interjected. Yet until Barbara embarrassed herself, no one had said a word. The guilt was settling in now. But guilt wasn't an apology, and Malik wasn't interested in empty words. Instead, he turned to Stephen. Since we're still here, let's discuss actual HOA violations. Stephen straightened, uneasy. Like what? Malik picked up his list. The same one Barbara had ignored when he submitted it weeks ago. Broken fences, trash bins left out for days, lawns that haven't been mowed in weeks. All of these violations exist. The room shifted. Lisa moved in. Her seat. Do we have the authority to do that? Stephen let out a slow breath. The board can vote for removal if an HOA officer is found abusing their position. Malik leaned forward. Then let's put it to a vote. Lisa hesitated, then nodded. I second that. One by one, hands began to rise around the room. Malik watched as the people who had once stood by silently now voted to strip Barbara of her title. It was ironic. If she had just left him alone, she would still be the HOA president, but her own actions had led to her downfall. However, the person who needed to realize this most was still in denial, because Barbara Whitman wasn't done yet. Barbara Whitman didn't take defeat lightly. The morning after a public humiliation at the HOA meeting, Malik spotted her standing at the edge of his driveway. She wasn't alone this time. Her husband, Richard, a man in his early 70s with a stiff posture and a scowl, stood beside her. Malik stepped onto his porch, arms crossed. "Something I can assist you with?" Barbara's voice was tight, controlled. "I want." Malik let out a short laugh. "That's not how real estate works. You lost your house due to unpaid fees. I legally purchased it. If you want it back, you'll have to buy it at market value." Barbara's hands balled into fists. "That's ridiculous. You're just trying to profit off me." Malik's expression hardened. "No, Barbara, I'm treating you exactly how you treated me." Silence stretched between them. For weeks, she had weaponized rules and regulations against him, convinced she held all the power. Now, the tables had turned. "We'll consider it," she said, her tone clipped. Malik nodded. "Take your time." As they turned to leave, Barbara hesitated and looked back at him. Something different in her expression. Not quite remorse, but the realization that she had never actually been in control. For weeks, she had been so focused on pushing him out that she hadn't seen the real danger. Her own actions had cost her everything. Malik let the moment linger before speaking. "Barbara," she turned stiffly. "Next time, judge someone after you truly know them." This was how it was supposed to be, addressing real issues instead of policing nonsense. Some neighbors still avoided eye contact, embarrassed by their silence, but others made an effort, slowly breaking down the wall they had helped Barbara build. One day, Lisa Hendricks, one of the few who had voted against Barbara, walked up Malik's driveway with a plate of cookies. "I know it's late," she said, shifting awkwardly, "but welcome to the neighborhood." Malik smiled, accepting the plate. "Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate it." As he took a bite of the cookies, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. The tide was turning. The community was beginning to recognize the truth, and he was no longer alone in this fight. Malik knew he had a long way to go, but for the first time since moving in, he felt hopeful. The battle with Barbara was far from over, but he was ready to stand his ground. He had fought hard for his place in this neighborhood, and he wasn't about to let anyone take it away from him. With each passing day, he felt more at home, surrounded by neighbors who were finally willing to see him for who he was, rather than the labels Barbara had tried to impose. He had built a life here, and he intended to keep it. As he stood on his porch, watching the sun set over the peaceful streets of Brentwood Estates, Malik felt a renewed sense of belonging. He was part of this community, and he would fight for his right to be here, no matter what it took.